I'm so proud of it. When you go to a classical concert, you look in the program, who's coming, who's playing, which symphony. In my case, they don't know, and I don't tell them. They only know when you go to Andre and his orchestra, you will have an evening you will never forget. And that is why we travel the world. I want to touch the hearts of the people.
If you have ever flipped past a PBS pledge drive, browsed a classical music DVD rack, or scrolled through the biggest touring act of the last 2 decades, chances are you have seen him. A silver-haired violinist in a candlelit ballroom, orchestra swirling behind him, tens of thousands of fans on their feet singing along to a 200-year-old waltz as if it were a stadium anthem. That is Andre Rieu, and for more than 3 decades he has quietly built one of the strangest and most successful fortunes in music, not through pop hits or streaming numbers, but by turning classical concerts into full-blown spectacles that regularly outsell rock and pop legends. He is not a household name in the way Springsteen or Sinatra were, and he will probably never trend on social media the way a chart-topping pop star does. Yet year after year, his name appears on Billboard's list of the world's highest-grossing tours, right alongside acts that sell out football stadiums. He owns a genuine 16th-century castle in the heart of his hometown. He plays on violins worth more than most people's homes. And he built all of it by doing something classical music insiders once considered impossible, making a 200-year-old dance form feel like the hottest ticket in town. This is the story of how a quiet, castle-obsessed boy from a small Dutch city became the most commercially successful classical musician alive, and exactly what that fortune looks like today. Andre Léon Marie Nicolas Rieu was born on October 1st, 1949, in Maastricht, a compact, history-soaked city in the southern Netherlands where Roman ruins sit a few streets from medieval churches. He was the third of 6 children in a household where music was not a hobby, but a profession and a discipline. His father, Andre Rieu, conducted the Maastricht Symphony Orchestra, and the household ran on the strict rhythms of rehearsal schedules and formal training rather than casual sing-alongs. Andre picked up the violin at age 5, and by his own later admission, his relationship with his father's world of classical music was complicated. He respected the craft his father demanded of him, but he also grew to resent the rigid, reverential atmosphere that surrounded traditional orchestral performance. The hushed concert halls, the formal dress codes, the unspoken rule that audiences should sit still and clap only when permitted. Even as a teenager, he sensed there was a gap between how thrilling classical music could feel and how stiff it was often presented. His formal training was rigorous by any standard. He studied at the Conservatorium in Maastricht, then moved on to further violin studies in Belgium, eventually completing his education at the Royal Conservatory of Brussels, where he trained under the respected violinist and teacher André Gerdeler. He graduated with the Conservatory's highest distinction, the Premier Prix, a mark of serious technical mastery. On paper, he was being groomed for exactly the kind of career his father had, principal chair in a respected orchestra, maybe a conducting post somewhere down the line. But there was another, less disciplined side of young Andre that would end up maturing just as much as his violin technique, his fascination with castles. He grew up devouring Tintin comic books, and one storyline in particular stuck with him. A tale in which the characters sell an invention and use the proceeds to buy a castle. Rieu has said that as a boy reading that story, he made a private promise to himself that he would one day live in a castle of his own. It sounds like a throwaway childhood fantasy, the kind most of us forget by adulthood. For Rieu, it became a blueprint. Rieu's professional path did not start with the grand orchestras and stadium tours he is known for today. His first real ensemble was a modest project. In 1978, he formed the Maastricht Salon Orchestra, a small group that let him experiment with a different kind of classical performance, one built around charm, accessibility, and audience connection rather than formality. It was a low-key venture, but it planted the seed for everything that followed. Around the same period, he also worked as a concertmaster with the Maastricht Symphony Orchestra, the very ensemble his father had once conducted, giving him a front-row seat to both the discipline of traditional orchestral life and its limitations as popular entertainment. The real turning point came in 1987, when Rieu founded the Johann Strauss Orchestra, named for the Austrian waltz king, whose compositions would become the backbone of Rieu's repertoire. He started with a modest group of 12 musicians and spent months drilling them not just on technical precision, but on a completely different performance philosophy. Eye contact with the crowd, visible joy on stage, arrangements designed to build energy rather than simply showcase virtuosity. The orchestra made its debut on New Year's Day, 1988, and while it did not turn Rieu into an overnight star, it gave him a vehicle finally built entirely around his own instincts rather than his father's traditions. Growth was steady rather than explosive in those early years. The orchestra built a loyal following through relentless touring and television appearances across the Netherlands and neighboring countries, expanding gradually from its original 12 members. By the mid-2000s, it had grown into a much larger ensemble, and depending on the specific tour and venue, the Johann Strauss Orchestra today can include anywhere from around 80 to well over 100 musicians, a scale that puts it closer to a full symphonic production than a chamber group. What set this growing ensemble apart from other orchestras chasing wider audiences was Rieu's refusal to treat popularity and musical seriousness as opposites. He kept the technical rigor his conservatory training had instilled in him, insisting on precise musicianship from every player he hired, while stripping away almost everything else that traditionally separated performer from audience. Musicians were encouraged to smile, to look up from their sheet music, to visibly enjoy themselves on stage. Concerts were arranged less like formal recitals and more like theatrical events, with lighting design, costume changes, and guest vocalists woven into programs that mixed genuine waltz classics with instrumental arrangements of film themes and popular songs. Audiences who had never bought a classical ticket in their lives found themselves clapping along, and audiences who had grown up on classical music found a version of it that felt alive rather than embalmed by tradition. That combination, serious musicianship wrapped in unapologetic showmanship, became the formula that carried Rieu far beyond the modest touring circuit most classical acts were confined to. Every long career has an inflection point, a single moment where visibility suddenly outpaces years of steady work. For Andre Rieu, that moment reportedly came in 1995 during the halftime break of a major football match in Amsterdam. Rieu purchased a short block of live television airtime to perform Dmitri Shostakovich's Second Waltz, a piece he had already made something of a signature. As the story is often told, a goal was scored moments before the segment aired, meaning the entire stadium crowd, and the television audience tuned into that goal, was still fully engaged when the cameras cut to Rieu's performance. The visibility was enormous, and by his own account, record sales spiked dramatically in the immediate aftermath. Whatever the exact mechanics of that single broadcast, the effect on his career was undeniable. Television exposure and a string of successful European tours followed in quick succession, and by the mid-1990s the media had settled on the nickname that would define his public identity for the rest of his career, the Waltz King, a modern echo of Johann Strauss to himself. What separates Andre Rieu from most classical musicians of his generation is not just his popularity. It is how deliberately he has run his career as a business. Classical music has traditionally depended heavily on government subsidies, arts grants, and institutional support, especially in Europe. Rieu built something closer to a self-sustaining commercial operation, closer in structure to a major pop touring act than a traditional orchestra. The scale of that operation is significant. The Johann Strauss Orchestra has repeatedly placed among Billboard's top-grossing worldwide tours, sharing that list with major pop and rock acts rather than other classical performers, a genuinely rare feat for anyone working primarily in orchestral music. By the late 2010s, industry trackers had recognized Rieu as one of the highest-grossing touring artists in classical music history, with career earnings from ticket sales alone running into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Running an operation at that scale requires serious infrastructure. Rieu has spoken publicly about the size of his organization, describing well over 100 people on his direct payroll, plus additional freelance staff who support tours, production, and recording, describing the whole operation as, in effect, an extended family that depends on the business running smoothly. Beyond the orchestra itself, His commercial footprint includes a recording studio, a production company that designs the elaborate sets and staging his shows are known for, and workshops that produce the orchestra's costumes. He has also been unusually attentive to the people who make the operation run. Musicians touring with the Johann Strauss Orchestra reportedly travel with dedicated catering, wellness support, and custom-built touring transportation, and Rieu has made a point of accommodating musicians who travel with young children, a level of care that is uncommon even among well-funded touring acts. This attention to logistics is not incidental to the business model. It is central to it. Rieu shows depend on consistency across dozens of cities and countries every year, often on tight turnaround schedules between venues. Keeping the same core group of musicians together for years at a time, rather than constantly cycling through hired freelancers, protects the tight, rehearsed chemistry that makes the live shows work, and taking care of those musicians' well-being on the road is part of what keeps that continuity intact. In an industry where orchestral musicians often piece together income from multiple part-time positions, offering steady, well-supported full-time work has also made the Johann Strauss Orchestra an unusually attractive place to build a career, which in turn has helped Rieu retain top-tier talent over the long term rather than losing players to better-paying opportunities elsewhere. The revenue side of the business is similarly diversified. Beyond live ticket sales, which remain the largest single source of income, Rieu's catalog of recorded albums and concert films has performed remarkably well for a classical act, with strong certified sales figures across multiple countries, particularly in Australia, where he was recognized as the best-selling music artist across several consecutive years regardless of genre. Concert films shot at his signature open-air performances in Maastricht have also found life well beyond the initial broadcast, playing in cinemas internationally and, in at least one instance, setting records for the highest-grossing concert film in British box office history. Merchandise, DVD releases, and licensing of his recordings for television and film further round out an income structure that looks less like a traditional orchestra's finances and more like a full media company built around a single performer. Rieu's approach has not been without its critics. Some voices within the classical music establishment have dismissed his shows as overly commercial or sentimental, arguing that his arrangements sand down the complexity of the original compositions in favor of crowd-pleasing spectacle. Rieu has generally responded to this criticism by leaning further into his own vision rather than retreating from it, describing his goal as creating what he has called a complete, immersive artistic experience. Music, costume, staging, and audience participation combined into a single joyful event, rather than a purist recital experience reserved for specialists. Not every chapter of Rieu's financial story has been a straight line upward. In 2008, he staged one of the most ambitious productions of his career, a tour built around a full-scale replica of Empress Sisi's castle from Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. At the time, reportedly the largest stage set ever built for a touring act. It was a spectacular, headline-grabbing production, and it was also staggeringly expensive. Rieu has acknowledged publicly that the cost of that stage set pushed his business to the brink of financial collapse, with the investment far outrunning what the tour was able to recoup in the short term. It is a detail that is easy to miss amid the talk of castles and Stradivarius violins. Even one of the most commercially successful classical musicians alive has come close to losing everything because of a single overambitious production decision. What allowed Rieu to recover was largely the same trait that got him into the industry's upper tier in the first place: his willingness to keep touring relentlessly and rebuild revenue through the diversified income streams his business had already established, rather than relying on any single production or investor to bail him out. While the Schönbrunn Castle replica nearly sank his finances, Rieu's other castle, a real one, has become the single most recognizable symbol of his success. In 1999, while on holiday in the south of France, Rieu received a call informing him that a historic building in Maastricht was going up for sale, a small, turreted castle known as Huis de Torentjes, meaning roughly House of the Little Towers. The building held a deeply personal connection for Rieu. As a boy, he had taken piano lessons inside its walls, lessons he remembered as somewhat gloomy and unglamorous at the time, in a building he found dark and in need of care. That earlier, unremarkable experience gave a 1999 purchase an unusual emotional weight. This was not simply an impulsive luxury buy. It was the literal fulfillment of the fantasy he had built as a boy reading Tintin comics, applied to the exact building where his own musical education had begun. He and his wife, Marjorie, purchased the property and spent years restoring it, reuniting sections of the castle that had been split apart during the 20th century when the building had been divided into separate residences for multiple families. The restoration itself was largely Andre's own creative project rather than the work of professional interior designers. He has described taking a hands-on role in brightening the interior, adding gold leaf detailing throughout, and furnishing the rooms with pieces collected during his travels across Europe. One of the standout additions is a French-style orangery he had built on the grounds, filled with tropical plants and birds, a personal touch he has described, with characteristic humor, as his version of buying an extravagant sports car. Rather than a fast vehicle, he wanted a greenhouse full of butterflies. The castle's history stretches back centuries before Rieu ever set foot in it. Parts of the structure, including its kitchen, date to the 1400s, with much of the surviving building constructed in the early 1500s. Local legend holds that the French musketeer D'Artagnan, the historical figure who inspired Alexandre Dumas's famous novels, once stopped there for a meal shortly before his death during the 1673 siege of Maastricht, adding another layer of storied history to the property. Maintaining a 500-year-old structure comes with constant costs. The soft, porous stone the castle was built from requires ongoing repair, and significant restoration work was carried out in the mid-2010s to address roof and wall damage caused by decades of erosion. Interestingly, despite owning this landmark property, Rieu and his wife do not actually live inside the castle full-time. They reside in a separate, considerably more modest historic house nearby, while the castle itself functions as an office, a media and event space, and, quite deliberately, a promotional backdrop that appears constantly in his concert films, interviews, and album artwork. It has become, in effect, both a private passion project and a permanent piece of his public brand. Beyond the castle itself, Rieu's real estate holdings in Maastricht extend considerably further, reportedly including dozens of properties throughout the historic district surrounding his home, several of which are used for offices, storage, and production purposes tied to the orchestra's operations. If the castle represents Rieu's childhood imagination made real, his violin collection represents something closer to his professional soul. Rieu has performed on multiple instruments crafted by Antonio Stradivari, the legendary 18th-century Italian luthier whose instruments remain the gold standard of the violin world more than 300 years after his death. Rieu has spoken about owning an early Stradivarius, made during the period when the young Stradivari was still refining his craft, and has described switching over the years to a later instrument from Stradivari's most mature creative period. Genuine Stradivarius violins are almost impossible to simply purchase on the open market. Only a small number of collectors, dealers, and institutions worldwide effectively control access to the surviving instruments, and Rieu has described how difficult it was to break into that tightly held network in his early career. Though once word spread that a well-known and well-funded performer was actively searching, offers reportedly began arriving with some regularity. The financial value of these instruments is genuinely extraordinary. Historically, the most expensive Stradivarius violin ever sold, the Lady Blunt, made in 1721, fetched roughly 15 million euros at auction, and other Stradivarius instruments regularly change hands for sums well into the millions. Owning and touring with instruments of this caliber requires an entire logistical operation of its own. Specialized insurance coverage, climate-controlled transport, and careful handling designed to protect centuries-old wood from temperature and humidity swings during international travel. Rieu's relationship with these instruments goes beyond their price tag. He has spoken about them with a kind of reverence usually reserved for close relationships, describing the emotional and historical weight carried inside a well-crafted antique violin. The sense that the wood itself has a history stretching back centuries, long before the instrument was ever assembled. It is this emotional connection, as much as the eye-watering resale value, that explains why he has continued to perform on genuine antique instruments throughout his career rather than switching to safer, less valuable modern violins for touring. Rieu's fortune has never been a solo project. He married Marjorie Kochman in 1975, long before his commercial breakthrough, and she has remained closely involved in both his personal and professional life ever since, from co-managing the castle restoration to playing an ongoing role in the broader Rieu organization. The couple has 2 sons, and one of them, Pierre Rieu, has become deeply embedded in the family business, working as a producer closely tied to the Johann Strauss Orchestra's productions and increasingly stepping into a public-facing role of his own within the organization. Succession is a subject that naturally comes up around any long-running, highly personal entertainment brand, and the Rieu family appears to be handling it gradually rather than treating it as a single dramatic transition. Pierre's growing production and business role suggests a family organization thinking seriously about how the Rieu name and operation continue over the long term, even as Andre himself, now in his mid-70s, continues to headline tours around the world. That gradual handover extends beyond Pierre